I used to believe that marriage was built on love, trust, and effort. That was my conviction when I married Grace 7 years ago. I wasn't a flawless man, but I was a devoted husband. I worked tirelessly, ensured the bills were paid, and always placed her needs above my own. But over time, something changed. It happened so gradually that I didn't even realize it at first. Small things, subtle shifts. Grace stopped greeting me at the door when I came home. The little messages she used to send throughout the day disappeared. At first, I dismissed it, thinking she was just exhausted or overwhelmed with work. But even when she was home, it felt like I was merely existing in her presence. She barely acknowledged me. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly dissolved into silence. Our evenings, once filled with laughter and shared moments, became nights where she sat on the couch glued to her phone or retreated to the bedroom early. The intimacy that once held us together faded, like a candle snuffed out by the wind. I tried to be patient. I kept asking, "Is everything okay?" Again and again, I got the same response. "I'm fine," she would say without even looking up from her screen. But she wasn't fine, and neither was our marriage. I started noticing a pattern, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I was always the one making an effort. If I didn't send the first text, there was no conversation. If I didn't initiate a hug or a kiss, there was no affection. If I didn't plan date nights, they simply never happened. I kept telling myself it was just a rough phase, that maybe she was stressed. But deep down, I knew the truth. People make time for what matters to them, and I was no longer priority. Every time I suggested something to rekindle our bond, there was an excuse. "I'm too tired. I have a headache. Maybe another time." But another time never came. One Friday night, I decided to do something special. I left work early, stopped by the store, and picked up everything I needed to make her favorite meal: pasta with homemade sauce, garlic bread on the side, and a nice bottle of wine. I wanted to remind her of how things used to be, of the love we once shared. I set the table, dimmed the lights, and even lit a few candles, just like I did when we were newlyweds. Then I waited, hopeful that tonight would be different. She walked in around 7 p.m., tossed her bag onto a chair, and barely glanced at me. "Hey!" I greeted her with a smile. "Hey!" she replied flatly. Her eyes flickered toward the table, toward the meal I had spent hours preparing. But she didn't smile. She didn't look surprised or touched. Instead, she muttered, "I already ate." I felt my chest tighten. "You already ate?" I repeated, my voice quieter now. "Yeah, I grabbed something with the girls after work," she said, slipping off her shoes. Then, without another word, she walked over the couch, sat down, and pulled out her phone. Like I wasn't even there, I sat across from her, waiting, hoping she'd notice my disappointment, that she'd at least acknowledge the effort I had put in. But she just kept scrolling, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen, completely detached from me, from us. After a few minutes, I finally spoke. "Grace." She didn't even look up. "What? Are we okay?" She let out an exaggerated sigh, the kind you give when someone is wasting your time. "Justin, why do you keep asking me that?" "Because we don't talk anymore. Because you don't even look at me the way you used to." She rolled her eyes. "I'm just tired. Not everything has to be some big problem." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to tell myself that maybe she really was just tired. But deep down, I knew the truth. She wasn't exhausted. She was indifferent. For a while, I let it go. I kept convincing myself that I was overthinking things, that every couple goes through rough patches, that eventually she'd snap out of it. But the reality was, it felt like I was living with a stranger. She wasn't my wife anymore, not really. She was just someone who happened to occupy the same space, someone who barely acknowledged my existence. It was as if I had been reduced from being her husband to nothing more than a background character in her life. And then one night, everything became painfully clear. We had dinner together, or at least I ate. Grace barely touched her food, her fingers endlessly scrolling through her phone. That was the moment I finally saw things for what they were. After finishing my meal, I got up and started cleaning. Something we used to do together, a task she once helped with. When I returned to the living room, she was curled up on the couch, still glued to her screen. The dim glow from her phone cast an eerie light across her face, which remained void of expression, completely disconnected from the world around her. I stood there for a moment, just watching her, feeling an unbearable weight settle in my chest. Enough. I walked over and sat beside her. "Grace, we need to talk." She didn't even glance up. "About what?" "About us. About this distance between us." With a sigh, she finally put her phone down, but there was no frustration, no concern, just indifference. "Justin, I don't know what you expect from me." My jaw tightened. "I want my wife back." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "I haven't gone anywhere." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Then why does it feel like I'm married to a stranger? We haven't been close in months. You barely touch me, barely talk to me. You act like you don't even want to be in the same room as me." She rolled her eyes. "I told you, I'm tired. Can't you just accept that?" "Tired?" I repeated, my voice laced with frustration. "That's all I ever hear. But what I see is someone who keeps finding reasons to push me away." She shook her head, letting out a mocking laugh. "Oh, so now you know how I feel? Well, if I want to be close, I will. And if I don't, then I won't. Simple as that." And then she said it. "What I do with my body is none of your business." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind stalled, struggling to process what I had just heard. "What?" My voice was barely above a whisper. She leaned back against the couch, arms still folded. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." Something inside me cracked. I wasn't demanding. I wasn't asking for anything I wouldn't give in return. I had been pleading for connection. "Grace, you don't understand. This isn't about obligation. It's about love. It's about wanting to be close to the person you vowed to spend your life with." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You're making this way more dramatic than it is. Not everything is about you, Justin." Silence. A cold, suffocating silence stretched between us. That was it. That was the moment I realized I was the only one still holding on. And I was done. I stared at her, really looked at her. This woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, and all I saw was someone who had let go of me a long time ago. For months, I had been grasping at scraps of affection, making excuses for her indifference. I had convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I was patient enough, she'd come back to me. But now I saw the truth. She wasn't coming back, because she had already left. She had checked out of this marriage long before this conversation. She had just been waiting for me to catch up, to finally see it for myself. And now I did. Something shifted inside me. The weight I had carried for years suddenly lifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was just done. I stood up. Grace frowned. "What does that mean?" I walked over to the chair, grabbed my jacket, and slid it on. "It means I understand you loud and clear." She let out a dry, almost amused laugh. "So what? You're just leaving?" I looked at her one last time, taking in the face of the woman who had once meant everything to me. "Yeah, I am." No shouting, no slamming doors, no dramatic goodbye. I simply turned and walked away. And for the first time in years, I felt free. That night, I checked into a hotel. I had nowhere else to go. My hands trembled slightly as I slid my credit card across the front desk, my mind still spinning from everything that had just happened. Sitting on the edge of the stiff hotel bed, I stared blankly at the wall, waiting for something: regret, sadness, anger. But all I felt was exhaustion. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't fighting anymore. I considered texting Grace. A small part of me even expected her to reach out first, to ask where I was, to at least pretend she cared. But as the hours stretched into days, my phone remained silent. One day passed, then another. Still nothing. That was when I knew I had made the right decision. She wasn't worried. She wasn't heartbroken. She wasn't even curious about where I had gone. She had become so used to me always being there, always chasing after her, that she simply assumed I would come crawling back. But I wasn't coming back. A week later, I finally received a message from her. Are you seriously leaving over this? Grow up. I read those words over and over, waiting for them to stir something in me. But there was nothing, and that was all the confirmation I needed. The next day, I filed for divorce. At first, she didn't take it seriously. She assumed I was bluffing, trying to prove a point. But when the papers arrived, reality finally set in. That's when the messages started. The calls, the late-night voicemails, her voice thick with desperation. Justin, please. I didn't mean it. I'll do better. We can fix this. You can't just throw this away. But she was wrong. I hadn't thrown anything away. She had, long before I ever walked out that door. At first, her pleas came in messages. Then the calls became relentless. Soon, she started showing up outside my office, near my gym, anywhere she thought she might find me. Eventually, she tracked down my new apartment, knocking on my door in the middle of the night, her voice raw with desperation, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she had shown before. Justin, please. I know I messed up, but I can change. We can fix this. I never answered, not to hurt her, not out of spite, but because I had already given her every opportunity to make things right when it still mattered. She swore things would be different. But love isn't just words, it's actions. And her actions had already shown me exactly where I stood. I hadn't been her husband. I had been a habit. Someone she assumed would always be there, no matter how little effort she put in. So I let go. Piece by piece, I moved forward. Some nights were harder than others. There were moments I caught myself reaching for my phone, tempted to call, to fall back into old patterns. But then I'd remember the way she had looked at me that night, the emptiness in her eyes when she said, "What I do with my body is none of your business." That wasn't something you said to someone you loved. That was something you said when you had already stopped caring. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. Signing those papers felt surreal. A part of me had expected to feel a sense of loss, maybe even regret. But when I set my pen down and slid the papers across the table, relief. That was all I felt. I was free. With that chapter finally closed, I shifted my focus to rebuilding. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends, and even rediscovered hobbies I had once abandoned. Life didn't stop, and neither did I. During my marriage, I had let pieces of myself slip away, things that once brought me happiness. But little by little, I started reclaiming them. And then I met her, Maria. She was nothing like Grace. Where Grace had been distant and detached, Maria was warm and present. Where Grace had made me feel invisible, Maria saw me. We met by chance, and before I knew it, casual conversations turned into dinners. Dinners turned into something more, something I hadn't felt in years. Happiness. For the first time in forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And then one evening, Grace showed up. It was late, just after 8, when I heard a knock at my door. I hesitated before answering, assuming it was a neighbor or a package I had forgotten about. But when I pulled the door open, there she was, Grace. Her hair was a mess, her eyes red and swollen like she had been crying for hours. She looked different, smaller. Somehow, the effortless confidence she once carried was nowhere to be found. "Justin," she whispered. Behind me, Maria stood in the living room, silent but watching. Grace's gaze shifted past me, landing on her. Her expression hardened, twisting with something sharp and bitter. "Who the hell is she?" she demanded, accusation dripping from her tone. I exhaled, already exhausted by the confrontation. "This is Maria, my girlfriend." Grace's mouth opened, then shut, a beat of silence. Then she let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Wow," she scoffed, shaking her head. "You really moved on that fast, huh?" I kept my voice steady. "Why are you here, Grace?" She ran a shaky hand through her hair, her anger flickering into something more fragile. "I tried dating," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I tried moving on, but nothing worked. Nothing lasted. And then I realized it was always you. It was always supposed to be you." I swallowed, feeling something unfamiliar. Pity, maybe. Frustration, definitely. But love? No. That part of me had died the night she told me my feelings didn't matter. It's too late, Grace, I said evenly. I begged you to care when it counted. I fought for us, and you didn't. And now you're here because you're lonely, because dating didn't work out for you. Her face twisted with anger. I can't believe you're doing this to me, she snapped. After everything we've been through. No, Grace, I said, my voice firm. After everything I went through. She stood there, breathing hard, her fists clenched at her sides. You think she's different? She scoffed, bitterness laced in every word. She'll leave you, Justin, just like I did, just like they all do. Maria didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. Instead, she reached for my hand, lacing her fingers through mine, standing beside me, unwavering. And that was the moment Grace understood. She had expected me to let her back in, expected me to be the same man who always forgave, always waited, always stayed. But that man was gone. We're done, Grace, I said at last. Don't come back. She lingered for a moment, mouth slightly open like she wanted to argue. But then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I closed the door behind her and locked it. Maria gave my hand a gentle squeeze. Are you okay? She asked softly. I turned to her, and for the first time in years, I smiled. Yeah, I said, and for once, I truly meant it.